We're
Hi, Terry.
excited. I mean, she's witty and she's.
It's awesome. Does she have a door?
So, welcome everybody, including Roseanne and Dawn. Hi, welcome to the audit committee's, the audit committee meeting. We have two things on our agenda, and I got a request to switch the order from one of my board colleagues, because she's running a few minutes late. And so, rather than starting out with the, and we won't take long. This isn't gonna take long, I don't wanna hold you up, but,
Also, Christian is joining us online.
I'm sorry?
Christian is joining us online.
Oh, Christian, great, thank you. Do we wanna go around and do introductions really quick?
Sure. I'm Janice Hansen, the internal auditor. Mary Catherine Moore.
Judy Brennan, Director, Enrollment and Transfer Center.
Michelle DePass, School Board,
I am gonna move up to the table,
please.
because it's so empty, it feels like it needs to be
Yeah,
filled in a little
I
bit. I'm
think
Don Wolf, I'm the Chief Technology Officer.
Roseanne, Town Board Manager.
Liz Large, Contractor General Counsel for the district.
Christian?
Caroline emailed saying that she wasn't able to make it.
Wasn't able to make, thank you, and I did get that. Christian, did you wanna introduce yourself?
Because that's what we said, 90% of the time, that was what it was, there you go, there you go.
We can't hear you,
Yeah, it's me.
it's you, okay.
It's not you, it's me.
Okay,
I should have it now. Alright, try again, Christian, please.
thanks for being here, Christian. So, I was saying that we've been asked to reverse the order of the agenda. We only have two things on the agenda today. The first was gonna be the internal audit report for the hardship petition transfers, but we'll start out with the performance evaluation of the senior internal auditor. And that's just an update to let you know that the her self-evaluation will be due at the end of May, and our job as a board is to do the review by the end of June, by the end of the school year. I just want to encourage anybody that's sitting here or members of the community, if you have any feedback, you're welcome to submit it to me, just to me personally, and I'll anonymize your feedback and include it in the final evaluation. Are there any questions about that? It's pretty straightforward.
Are the other directors, is Director Van members coming?
She is on her way.
Okay, I didn't get anything from her,
In
but,
fact, I think she's calling in right now. I see her online.
okay.
She's en route.
And Amy is on her way, but we can't hold the conversation up, so she'll just have to miss part of this conversation.
And I think the road is now for.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, so the next thing on the agenda is the internal audit report for the hardship petition transfers, and I'm really excited to hear about this. Appreciate the printed copies. So I'll just let you take it from here.
Great, thank you so much. I am really excited to talk about this report today because it's really the only thing on the agenda, so I have a long time to talk about it. So this is really exciting to get to talk about it for so long. But I will cut it short to make sure we can leave potentially early if there aren't a lot of questions. So I printed the report for everybody here. It's also posted online, so if you're joining from online, you can open it on workbooks. Since we do have some time, I do kind of want to walk through this
Yes,
report
please.
with you guys. So to start, let's open the report to page 5. And I'm just gonna kind of start a little bit, I'm not gonna read everything, but just getting some highlights here. So generally, Portland Public School students are expected to enroll in their neighborhood school. And opportunities to attend other schools or specialty programs like the focus option is available using the lottery system. So that is the So if the students or families don't want their child to go to the neighborhood school, then they can apply for a transfer. So a hardship petition transfer is an opportunity to transfer to another neighborhood school or a focus option school that is not allocated during the lottery process. We have the lottery process, and then this is something different. It is a hardship petition transfer. So this audit was requested by members of the Board of Education who had indicated there was a concern that the hardship petition transfers were not granted or denied consistently on a standard set of criteria, and that there was like a lack of visibility into the process, which is totally makes sense. So we took on the audit and we had 3 primary objectives. The first objective is to assess the adequacy of internal controls related to decisions to grant or deny a hardship petition request, specifically to determine whether there is adequate documentation to support the decision and decisions were consistent. The second objective was to determine whether the school district is compliant with policies and procedures applicable to the hardship petition transfer process. And the third objective was to determine whether the hardship petition transfer requests have a disproportionate or inequitable impact on a student/school community. So to address these objectives, we took a 3-year range where we got data for 3 years. So we looked at 18-19, 19-20, and 20-21 school years. And this is the overall primary conclusion. So based off the results of the audit, we found strengthening internal controls over the hardship petition transfer process is necessary to maintain the overall integrity of the program. And while instances of non-compliance were identified, the audit did not identify any evidence of intentional bias or lack of care. So I want to make sure to be clear about that because, you know, when there's a lack of clarity in some of the guidance, you'll see that we disagreed with some of the petition outcomes that were decided on, but they were, you know, there was no lack of care or intentional bias or anything like that. So that's really an important thing to notice. I thought that was great. If you turn to page 6, these are the recommendations. But I'm going to wait to go over them as I go over each objective, but I did summarize them there on page 6. If you go to page 8, I just wanted to look at that top paragraph there called roles and responsibilities. So just to be clear about what roles and responsibilities are, it's PPS management has the primary responsibility to establish, implement, and monitor internal controls. Internal audit's function is to assess those internal controls and test them to see if they provide reasonable assurance that the controls are adequate and operating efficiently. So I was thinking, since we had the time, but I'll be quick, whether or not I should give a good definition for what internal controls were. I don't think I've really talked about that in depth, so I just went to Wikipedia and it had a great definition, so I'm going to read it.
Be careful.
So hopefully it's not AI, but I did make sure it agrees with what my definition is. But an internal control, as defined by accounting or auditing, is a process for ensuring an organization's objectives and in operational effectiveness and efficiency, reliable financial reporting, and compliance with laws, regulations, and policies. A broad concept, internal controls involve everything that controls risk to the organization. So I will give you just a little example. When we were looking at the petition process, there were lots of things going on, but before the final decision was made, the director would do a final review to approve or deny. So the specialist has already looked at it and given their recommendation, so we identified that review that's done at the end before final approval as a key control. And so, there's lots of controls going on, pretty much everything we do to make sure something happens the way it should happen, that's really an internal control. So we didn't test every single element. We identified the key controls in the process and tested those to see how are they working and do they ensure compliance. So just a little bit about internal controls in case you guys are excited.
So I have a question about internal controls, and we might want to wait until later in the conversation, but most of the recommendations, suggest improving internal controls around these processes. So I think we as a committee need to have a conversation about what specifically some of those process improvements might be, or at least we need to discuss, what is the process of the management response to articulate what those improved internal controls might be, because I want to make sure that staff has enough guidance to know, how to implement these recommendations, because improved internal controls is fairly general.
I think it gets more specific though.
It does, but I like where you're going with that.
Yeah,
So what I'll do is after each objective, when I go over the recommendations, I'll go over them and then we'll just take a break and talk about it for a few minutes after each objective.
Great.
Okay. So for the scope of the audit, we're still on page 8, halfway down the page. For the scope of audit, I just wanted to point out that there is a transfer process into and out of the district as a whole. And there is a separate policy and procedures related to that. That is not included in the scope of this audit. We are only looking at the transfers inside the school district. So I just wanted to clarify because they are separate rules. Okay, so if you'll turn to page 10, we'll start with objective 1. So objective 1 was to assess the adequacy of internal controls related to decisions to grant or deny a hardship petition transfer request. Specifically determine whether there is adequate documentation to support the decision and the decisions are consistent. So in this background information, I broke it out into 3 sections. What I am trying to present here is the criteria on how am I going to assess this. So the first section talks about documentation. What is the rule for documentation? And there is an administrative directive and a policy in federal and state laws about record retention, so I kind of listed that information there. For the decision making, I had 3 primary sources of information to take into consideration when looking at the decision. The first one is the policy. The second is the administrative directive, and then also information available on our website. So anything that was publicly available that I could get a hold of was what I used to help make a decision. One thing that I did note is that the term hardship is not defined in our policy or administrative directive, but we do use the term on the website. So I think I kind of went back and forth on this, but if we're going to go all in on the term hardship, there's some recommendations for that, or get
To
rid of the
define
term.
what's considered a hardship.
Right.
And what's.
Yeah, so that's a little bit later, but just as a note, we do use the term on our website, it's just not defined. Our administrative directive does define the term extraordinary circumstances, which is really what I used in lieu of a formal definition. So the extraordinary circumstances as defined in the administrative directive say a petition transfer is a request to transfer to a school other than the student's neighborhood school based on extraordinary circumstances. And extraordinary circumstances is defined as, which is on the top of page 11, the basis for granting or denying petition transfers. They include urgent family situations or situations that pose imminent health, safety, or serious educational concerns for the student. A list of typical reasons for petition transfer requests are available on the ETC website. So that's the really heavy definition for what I tried to assess the decision on. Further in the administrative directive, it does say that petition transfers are considered for students and family only if there are extraordinary circumstances. So I tried to pull out the key elements of the policy and the administrative directive that I took into consideration when thinking about the decision. So I think it's important, which is why I put it in bold for you guys, on the middle of page 11, just to be fair, like the guidance was high level, and so it was necessary for us to use our judgment to conclude in some situations. So ultimately, I know that there's some disagreement on some of the decisions specifically, but I don't think that part is important. So, if we make sure that it is clear and concise moving forward, it won't be an issue moving forward. The third element and part of objective 1 is related to available space. This one is a really unique situation. So in the policy, it does say that petitions will be considered on an individual basis on a standard set of criteria, taking into consideration available space at a requested school. So that's in the policy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the administrative directive, there's no follow through on what that available space kind of,
Who determines?
what that means. So,
So Janice,
yes,
can I ask a question about that?
yes.
So say you have a high school that's like over capacity and yet there's still hardship transfers. How is that reconciled within the system? Because if the rule is available space, or is it that potentially somebody, say if it was a overcapacity high school, but they got the transfer at a middle grade level and they're going into the high school? Or so if we have a space available requirement, how is it that we have hardship transfers going into high schools that are already like over capacity?
Because the way that it's written is the available space should supersede the criteria of the hardship transfer.
Yes. So even if you have a defined hardship, even if there is a hardship that everybody agrees on, we said, yes, this meets the definition. If there is no space, it's actually denied. So.
Okay, but I don't think that's what happens. Is that's what I'm asking, is like, so if we take Grant and Franklin, I'm sure there's hardship transfers and yet they're over capacity. So how is that happens?
Well,
Yeah, and it's a really good question that I have too.
this is good. I'm so glad you're asking and we have the time, so I will be a little bit more detailed than what I have in the report. I knew that was going to be a question because I asked as I went throughout the audit, what do you hear about this process? What are your concerns? And that was one of them. And so just wanted to be very specific. I went into the data and I looked specifically for hardship petition grants, hardship petition transfers specifically to grant, because I wanted to test them to see if anybody was getting in, and I found none that were approved to grant, period.
Based on the
hardship.
Well, no, based on the space availability though?
Right, they were all denied. So any petition that was to grant, even if there was a hardship, I didn't see that it was approved to get in there.
Because if we're following the policy, the
There's no
space available
Right.
supersedes any of those other conditions.
Right.
So I'm a little bit confused though, because when we looked at when we were doing some of the early sort of Southeast Guiding Coalition, and this was around Creston moving into Kellogg, and then Kellogg feeding into Franklin. There was something like 200 non-neighborhood students at Franklin, and so are they there because they're not there on hardship transfers? They're there some other way? But there were hundreds of other the non-neighborhood students who were there. So are they in a different category of how they got transferred in if they're not neighborhood, or is it something else?
Can I just talk you through the rest of this available space section, and then I will address that, if that's okay?
Or if the middle school, if there's some condition that happens between middle school and.
It doesn't carry over.
It doesn't.
And I looked for that too. So I thought I heard that carry over from one school, so we specifically looked for transitions, like in 5th grade. I looked for petitions that were applied for in the 5th grade to see if the next year they went to their neighborhood middle school or if they followed their cohort in their non-neighborhood school. And they either applied for another petition transfer to follow their cohort, or they returned. So I did look specifically for that. But let me just explain this section. It is complicated, which is why we have time to talk about it. So, okay, so we interpreted this to mean that even if a reason for the hardship petition transfer is verified, the request may be denied or the student may be placed on a waiting list if there's no available space in one of the requested schools. So they can request up to 3 schools and rank them. So if there's no space in their first school that they wanted, the ETC department is looking at their second choice and looking to see if there's space available there. So I had a couple of situations that I wanted to point out because they were kind of exceptions to that initial interpretation. So the first one is we noted there was some written communication about Grant High School being overcrowded. And so what we found is, and so there was actually some petitions wanting to transfer out of Grant to a different neighborhood school. In this one situation I put in here, it was to McDaniels. And even though there wasn't really a hardship, that was approved because there's overcrowding at Grant. So even if it's just one transfer, there's written communication to transfer them out. So that's kind of one situation that was unique, and so we said that was fine. There was another written communication that identified a need to increase enrollment at Vincent. And so when applications that came in, even if they didn't really describe a hardship, they were approved, and we did not take exception to that because we have in writing that there is a need to increase enrollment there. So high level for available space, we interpreted it very high level, and these are 2 kind of examples where we didn't follow our own interpretation, so I wanted to point those out. So to determine, if you go to page 12, middle of the page, that paragraph before the chart is, to determine whether there's space available at a requested school, ETC staff rely on direct communication with the requested school. Currently, ETC staff email the requested school administrator, typically the principal or the vice or assistant principal, to inquire if the school has available space to accept a transfer student to an identified grade. ETC does not currently have a way to independently determine whether a requested school has available space in an identified grade without the direct communication with the school.
That is an example of a potential internal control that could be strengthened.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
so we can talk about that.
Yes, also it could be automated, it could be an AI.
It should,
To remove the subjectivity.
it should be a function of the chief of schools office, like what is the capacity of this school? Like every school has a number. Yeah.
So what I was wondering, well, what is that number? Every school, every class, we have to have a number. Where does it, it's gotta come from somewhere. So I found it in the budget book.
Yes.
And this is the chart that's used for staffing.
Yes.
So I put this in here to give you an idea of what, at some level, this is really the only thing I could find in writing that establishes a class size maximum. So I put it in here, and the maximum class sizes are identified, but this is for staffing. I think it's important to note that when determining whether to accept a transfer student, there could be lots of rational reasons why you don't want to staff a room to be at the exact max. But this is what documentation I could find in writing that establishes a max. So that's what I used. So to get back to what Director Brennan Edwards was asking about, if the decision whether to approve or deny the request based off space available comes directly from the school. So if the principal replies and says, yes, we have space, it's approved, moving forward. That is the primary thing that ETC relies on. They don't have access to direct data about how many students are in each class at any given point. Information is available in Synergy, but there's lots of other determining factors. So this is how they do it. This is their process, and what I found is that the process needs some improvement. So let's talk about the objective results. So the first part of the results at the bottom of page 12, the first couple results are related to the decision. So whether or not the petition was granted based off of what we interpreted as a valid hardship, based off the guidance that we kind of talked about. So there were a couple of instances where we did not agree. So in 2 instances, students were accidentally enrolled in a school that was not their neighborhood school. The petition was submitted and approved after the accidental enrollment. I think that it's fair.
By accidentally mean not meeting the criteria.
Or going out of order, in other words, enrolling your child at the school and then filling out a transfer.
So these are very unique situations that we just happen to come across in the 225 that we picked, but so it seems to be that the parent arrived at the school to enroll their student and was enrolled. And subsequently realized this is not their neighborhood school.
Yeah.
So I can see how potentially an argument could be made that it would present a hardship for them subsequently to have to go to their neighborhood school after they were initially enrolled at this non-neighborhood school, but I just disagreed with it. So I know there's rational ways back and forth. I'm just saying that we didn't find that there was any hardship for these students. Anyways, okay, the next one. In 9 instances, the petition transfer requests were approved to the requested school due to space being available at the requested school, not because the petition demonstrated a valid hardship.
It should be an and, not an either.
Right. That's my interpretation of the way that it is presented. Again, every single one of these instances is very unique, and we can go back and forth and about the rationale one way or the other, but this is the conclusion that we kind of reached. And then if you go to the top of page 13, there was one instance where the petition request was approved after initially being denied due to no space being available at the requested school. The student was not placed on a waiting list. The petition was subsequently granted. At the time the petition was granted, the waiting list had 3 students on it, but that waiting list was expired. So, per the administrative directive. The space should be filled and when available based off the waiting list. So a little bit about waiting list there. The next section is about the supporting documentation. So I want to differentiate a little bit here about supporting documentation. For us to really come to a determination of whether or not we agreed with the decision to approve or deny it, we were looking for very explicit documentation, like emails sometimes, or sometimes there were notes in the schoolment system. So we were looking for those minute details to help us determine whether or not we agreed. When it comes to maintaining documentation to meet our state, federal requirements for retaining educational records, they don't make you save every single email or every single element. So I think it's important to differentiate. And in
Are you saying there's no retention schedule? Or
no, there is.
There's a retention
We talked about the
schedule,
retention schedule. It's for 4 years.
but
But I was looking for documentation to help me look at that decision. The record retention.
you're just looking for the
requirement-
presence of
Yeah.
supporting notes.
Yes. Which is not an element to be required saving for the record retention requirements. So some things are required to be saved, like the approval letters or the communications and stuff like that. Those minute details are things that I was looking for that I couldn't find to help me arrive at a decision. So
Sorry, just to
Just to
clarify, does that
differentiate a
mean
little
the actual decision, like, we looked at it, here's the criteria, these are why we made it either decision to approve or deny, that is not that's not required and is not saved.
almost most of the time it's there, and there were lots of notes. There were only 6 instances where the documentation that was saved was just not enough for us to be able to see the rationale for the decision making. I thought this was going to be super exciting because we get to talk about this, but faces are not looking very exciting. So bear with me, don't go to sleep. It is exciting stuff. So I just wanted to differentiate between what is expected for record retention requirements. I was looking for more. In only 6 situations was I not able to find that additional information that I was looking for to understand the decision-making process.
Still 6 out of that
225.
225.
Yeah.
That's the same cohort. That's the whole testing.
I only tested 220.
Okay, but the same 225
Yep, use the same 225 that we
for the
selected
various tests.
for all the different tests. Right.
So while the law doesn't require it, it's not something that, it's something that PPS could require though.
Yeah, I think to understand the decision-making process, so what I would recommend is that we meet the record retention requirements. More than that would be great to understand the decision-making process. That's not necessarily required. So I want to be by the by the record retention requirement. So
Could we make an improvement just based on best practices though? Like
Sure.
maybe
Just wanted
best
to
practices to save
differentiate,
notes
yeah.
I mean,
related to the transfer.
just to that point, I mean, there's always like the compliance standard, which we always wanna meet, but I think it's kind of like there's this urban myth, I mean, as long as I've been around PPS, even when I was a student, about like who gets transferred, what the criteria is, and it always seems kind of like a mystery, and so it seems like it would be good for the district, just credibility and trust of like, we keep all that, it's all documented, so it just seems like it would take away some of what people sometimes think, like, my
The
transfer got,
perception.
my transfer got approved, theirs didn't, why is that? Again, it seems like it would just be great for also just transparency for families about like how the district comes to its decision.
Because you didn't because there isn't a consistent template that you find with every file. Like you had to review in the ones you pulled whether or not they met the criteria. So as an implementation of an internal control, it seems like it wouldn't be that difficult to just create a template that would accompany every file that said, were these conditions met?
A
And
checkbox
then-
or something,
yeah,
just a small list.
And then,
or,
so
yeah.
that is available with every file.
I agree. So what I did is I wrote that note down, so we don't forget to come back to that, because we'll talk about that specific recommendation in a few more minutes. Okay, so the third, so that was related to supporting documentation. The last part of this objective is related to available space. So I'm going to read this to be very clear about what am I saying here. So in testing 225 petition requests, we identified 11 requests for elementary school students that were requesting a transfer within the student's current grade that were denied due to no space. So let me explain that, because I really had a hard time identifying how to test whether or not space was available. So if a petition was presented in this year, but it's applying for next year, then we're looking at forecasting information to determine whether or not there's space in that school. So that's not as far, I did not want to go that far, because it was very complicated. And also, the decision about space available in high schools is much more complicated, because you have to have space in certain core classes, or it's a lot more complicated. So what I did is I found within my 225 applications that were in elementary school, and they were applying for a transfer within the same year. So it's December, and I want to transfer immediately. Is there space in that class? That I could answer yes or no. I was able to go into Synergy and get the class roster for the time where it was, and look to see whether or not they were at their max class. Okay, so just to clarify, not all 225 were tested. I only tested in this very limited, just to see whether or not relying on feedback from the principal makes sense. I'm testing the control, okay? For each of the 11 hardship petition requests, we compared the current size at the time the petition was submitted to the approved max class size applicable for the school year, for the school and the grade, and based on approved max class sizes for the school and grade, it appears space was available at each of the 11 requests.
Even though they'd been denied.
Yeah, they were denied due to no space, but none of those 11 classes that were requested were at their max. I was gonna do a chart about how many, but it varied some, but I can say that there were at least 2 spaces available, 2 below the max for all of them. Sometimes more, but always at least 2.
But since there's no clear guidance for principals on how to make that determination, for all we know, principals may be making it based on their overall student enrollment, not by class or by their forecast. So.
I agree. Yep. So, the last element that we tested for objective 1 is related to consistency. And I want to congratulate the ETC Center, because I found they were very, very consistent. So if they were, there was actually a couple that I asked about, like, for example, some were transportation related were approved, and some transportation related didn't seem approved. And then when we went and talked about it, they were very consistent in the way in which they approved. It wasn't totally obvious, but they were very consistent, which I think is great. So just want to point out positive things.
Yes.
So we had 3 primary objectives for objective 1, or 3 primary recommendations. So those recommendations are to strengthen internal control structure to ensure petition requests are approved or denied in alignment with the school district's policy and administrative directive. Also, to strengthen internal control structure to ensure adequate documentation to support the petition request is retained in alignment with state and federal record retention requirements for educational records. And then third, we recommend the ETC establish and implement internal controls that will ensure determination of available space is on a standard set of criteria.
Yeah.
So those are very high level recommendations and don't really provide a lot of details. So if you flip to where I gave you a tag on your report to page 40. I wanted to talk a little bit about more detailed recommendations. So on page 40, you'll see there's the 3 primary recommendations. And then to assist the ETC department in implementing the recommendations, we included some more detailed recommendations for consideration. So, things like define the term hardship in your administrative directive, utilize a wait list. So the recommendations are very high level. And then here are some more detailed recommendations that they can pick from. Maybe they want to implement some of them, not all of them. The primary recommendation is that they strengthen the internal control structure to ensure the outcome. And these are ideas in which they could strengthen. Okay, so does that kind of make sense the way I presented the, okay. So
I would
I want to stop after this objective to answer any questions that I didn't fully answer or chat about implementation or anything about objective 1.
I think that your specific suggestions are good and hit most of the primary points there. I do think we should spell out that it would be useful to have a consistent format that showed how each of the criteria had been met.
Right. I want to reiterate how different every single petition request was. I was quite shocked.
Their reasons.
The reasons were so different, just of such a huge variety. We'll talk more about it in objective 3, but it was very complicated.
You're not seeing any trends, in other words. In other words, when you're collecting that kind of data, 225 or 10,000, you can start to see trends, but you weren't, because it was each.
It was hard to see a trend, so we'll talk about that in objective 3.
On the reasons.
Yep, and the reasons, yeah. Okay, did I ultimately answer your question? So to make sure I answer, we did look specifically at transition grades to see if there was carryover with the cohort. And of the ones we tested that were transition grades, so either from 5th grade to 6th grade or from 8th grade to high school, those did not transfer with their current cohort. So if they were in a middle school, elementary school, that's not their neighborhood school, they either applied to go to the school with the cohort from, or they transitioned to the middle school that was their neighborhood school. We found no exceptions to that in any of the ones we tested, and we were specific to make sure and have in our 225 those in the 8th grade transition year and 5th grade transition year, specifically looking for the transition. I can't say it doesn't happen, but I saw all the ones we tested were very clearly they either went back to their neighborhood school or there was another application to transition with their cohort.
I guess maybe my question is for Judy, or just again going back to the Franklin example, where there were, the recollection is, I can go back in time and say, but there were hundreds of students at Franklin who were not neighborhood students who weren't in a articulated program, and so if our rules say, because Franklin it's from the day it reopened in 2018 has been over capacity, then, and the rules say there has to be space available, how did those students get in? Or did they get in a way that in a route that wasn't a hardship transfer and therefore the space available didn't count?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
they didn't go through.
I'm
the
interested
channel.
in-
I just think it's fair to put anybody on the spot with such a minute detail.
It's
but,
not a minute, it's a huge issue, frankly, because there's kids who, there's a sense of, hey, we can't go to our neighborhood school, or our neighborhood school is totally crowded, and we have an I'm just trying to understand it, to be able to answer to people.
No, I hear you.
I'd be interested to know whether in fact that is the case, Judy.
Well, the data that we saw very clearly, and I guess I can pull it back up, had that, so if it may not be transfers, and that's a whole other issue then, but I thought it was.
Yes. So, petition transfers, which is the sole focus of this audit, and really the heart of the work in enrollment and transfer. As I noted in my response, we are back up to pre-pandemic levels. I think today I signed off on, we've had 2,280 petition transfer requests made for this current school year.
Wow.
Wow.
And I think I signed off on at least one current year transfer request for today.
5%.
And we are not back at pre-pandemic enrollment levels, but we are back at pre-pandemic petition levels. So this is the heart of what we do. We welcome the chance to have such a thorough review. But it isn't a picture of every element of enrollment for any school, let alone the whole district. So specifically to high school enrollment and students who attend a high school who live outside of the district. As you know well, some of those students may be there because of the immersion program and it's their feeder. Franklin's feeders would be the Russian immersion program, students in Spanish immersion who live in the Cleveland neighborhood or the Franklin neighborhood, or at least that was their neighborhood school when they entered 9th grade.
Okay.
After entry in 9th grade, if you move to any other neighborhood, including neighborhoods outside of Portland Public Schools, we allow, and I'll be coming to you, board members, on
Yes.
April 25th, or just a plug for the interdistrict transfer process, for the process that allows students to remain with their cohort through graduation, even if they move out of district,
Highest level of whatever school.
their current school. So those factors contribute to the number of students who are in a school but are not residents of that neighborhood. And we work with the Office of Schools to determine how priorities will be met, and at the start of a transfer cycle, look at schools, particularly overcrowded schools, particularly with high schools, Grant and Franklin. And we ask the questions and work with Margaret, Calvert, and T to say what's the process that you want us to follow? I will tell you that we've said yes to siblings this year. So we've said yes at our level to siblings. Everyone else gets denied. It could be approved at the appeal level. The only other cases that I know of where we've said yes are cases where we've been instructed by the Office of Schools that there's an urgent situation that they feel needs to be addressed by a specific transfer. So that's our practice.
Yeah, I mean, there's still this story around Franklin where a whole basketball team dropped in to Franklin and then the next year all transferred out.
So I understand the stories, I really do. Every now and then I get to participate in them. But the other thing that I wanna say is Franklin was amazing in 2018 and 2019 where we worked with them, Lincoln did it as well, and we did an address review of every incoming 9th grader, but that's not the district standard. So once your address is confirmed, and it could be when you're a kindergartner, you roll forward
Yeah.
There isn't anything in the system that pauses, and in some ways that what we learned through that experience of the pilot at Franklin and in particular, is that the burden of proof falls heavily on families, lower income families, families who have been in transitional housing, and
I was gonna say something about this as well.
and so and there are others who find a way to meet that burden in their own creative ways, and then decide later that that they actually have another address. So all of those are factors. Like, we care deeply about having appropriate enrollment at every one of these schools, and only allowing transfers that meet the district's goals. Like, we don't want to have our own standard, right? We want to be an effective reflection of what the district wants to see. And it's been a long time since these things have come under review. Like the Superintendent's Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer, your former colleagues, like that was 2014, 2015 when they concluded their work. So this doesn't get reviewed and get that level of attention very often. We look forward to what comes out of this process so that it can help us both update and improve documentation such as the administrative directive, even the policy if needed, and certainly now that we have resumed quarterly meetings with our we call it the transfer review group, then we're working collaboratively to try and make sure that all of these systems align to get you the results that we're looking for.
I like to point out.
I was gonna recognize you.
Okay.
You have a question.
I have a question. Do we have the data on average that some schools probably receive more transfers in than they get out, and for other schools it might be vice versa? The problem is there a distinct pattern here between schools? If there is economic correlation,
I'll talk
there
about
might be
that in
limited
objective
in here. I created like an example flow chart here. It might be hard to see, where we can look at maybe what an example how we can solve this more algorithmically. So I think we agree that everyone in a district who's already in the school and in the district, they should be enrolled because everyone has to get into a school. Then the question asks is, like, for non-district residents, does physical danger get immediate priority, and if they don't have space, do we enroll them in another school they initially didn't want, rather than send them back to the school where they were in danger?
Or their second choice.
Oh yeah, second.
Is your algorithm going from right to left?
It's a flood. There's no code here. So.
Okay.
Basically, then we can talk about family circumstances. So do we take, now we have to ask the question, if we want to do it algorithmically, we have to figure out what are our priorities? Does family go over academic or transportation issues, or does personal preference, should that go last, or should that be ranked above, let's say, I don't know. And also the question is also, like, I have a friend personally who actually lives completely outside of Portland, even beyond Beaver. Now the question is, they went to IWLs for 3 years, including the COVID year. Should they still have priority over people, let's say, who have academic issues at other schools? I mean, people who are alumni of feeder schools, let's say I went to, instead of Robert Gray, I went to West Sylvan. Do I then have a higher standing to get into Lincoln, or do I have to go back to IWLs? I mean, there's many stories like this, and I think we should probably take a closer look at some sort of flow chart. So, and if we publish a flow chart, we can also make it more transparent to parents.
I like the idea of using an algorithm all the time for decision making, because I think it takes some of the human element out of it. And this idea of ranking, we could do some ranking, I think, based on what our stated values are. So I think this idea of weighing, order of importance of safety, for instance, coming first, I thought was a good one. And I don't know what the other factors are, but
And ones described as hardship that we have so far, I mean, we could change them.
Yeah.
I think we should split hardship into different tiers. Because physical danger should obviously take priority over. It's I don't want to walk a mile.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Or transportation.
Yeah.
Physical safety.
Okay, I wrote that.
Judy, thank you for your explanation too. Just thank you, because I got a good sense of how the conditions you're working through, and just also the sheer number of petitions.
But, it also begs the question that we have a review committee and we have, director of high schools weighing in. I mean, that contributes to a some sense of lack of transparency with the community about how these decisions are being made. And so those should be factors that contribute to, prioritizing level of hardship, or, I'm not saying those people shouldn't be weighing in, but we should still be able to clearly document in a transparent way, here's the criteria, here's how they were or were not met, as opposed to or like, here's a blanket, statement from the district saying such and such school is under enrolled. We would like to consider it a priority for transfer in, like basically approve all transfers in. But I think it's really important to have a clearinghouse for those value statements and for those criteria so that people can see that.
Yeah, I totally agree, because I think that eliminates a lot of the just suspicions about the system.
Yes.
I say, for example, just all the reasons that were given about why Franklin may be overcapacity, they make sense. And I think if people knew that, it's like, oh, that's why things are a little bit tighter. So again, I think just like the more information we provide and how decisions are made gets people to be like maybe I'm disappointed, but I understand why I didn't get that wasn't approved, or I understand why our classes are fuller, the building is fuller, because yeah, it makes sense about it.
But the other factor that contributes to sort of scuttlebutt in the community is that people are not truthful frequently. And that is, Judy, I know how rigorous that process was at Lincoln and at Franklin. And I don't believe that staff on your team or on the ground in those schools could have done more to verify. And yet I know a lot of people presented false information because I know those kids. I know who the people tell me who those kids are all the time because they're mad, because they're making classes bigger and they're taking spots on sports teams, and people, it's obvious. So that's unfortunately a factor that we can't control. And
Where would
those
these
controls
kids go otherwise, by the way? I'm just curious.
Most of them are in district students, so they're just
like from all over or specific areas?
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
over.
Okay, I wanna kind of get back
Anyway,
to them
yes.
on it.
But
Because
that's-
I was excited about a whole hour, but it's going by so fast, so let's get back to this. I did write these 2 ideas down that we'll circle back to. So that's kind of the overall summary for objective 1. If you will go to page 17, it starts objective 2. This is to determine whether the school district is compliant with applicable policies and procedures. So in the background section, I went into the policy and I pulled out very specific detailed line items as well as what's in the administrative directive to be very nitpicky about what does it say in the administrative directive, what does it say in the policy, and what are our operations. So if you flip to page 18, we will kind of talk about the results because the background is just the key elements of the administrative directive and the policy. So if you'll look there, the first kind of thing that's identified as an exception. So the administrative directive says all procedural handbooks and guidelines for this administrative directive are available at the district's enrollment and transferring center and schools. Well, really, there is no procedure book, handbook of any, it's just what's available on our website. So that could definitely be clarified. There's no procedure handbook, it's not available anywhere. So updating that to be, so that's how nitpicky I was in looking at the administrative directive. So updating that to say information available on the website is just as, yeah. But I was picky. So then the next one, there were 2 sections of the administrative directive that talk about wait lists. One section says students may be placed on a wait list, and then in another section it says ETC manages and maintains a wait list for everything. So either it's may or you are, it's either one, you know, so being clear, are they required to maintain a wait list? I mean,
Yeah.
it says maintains, but it also says may. So
Yeah.
let's
May, yeah.
nitpicky, but just be consistent in what the expectations are. So that's kind of one
It
element.
says may because not all schools have waitlists.
Well, if
Well,
there is
Yeah,
no
it could
space,
be for that reason.
if there is no space, then the theory is that they should have a wait list. But I hear but anyway, so these are just little nitpicky things, okay, about the administrative directive. These are things that hopefully can get updated, no major issues. But the next one here is about the so the 4th bullet point down on page 18. It says, before a petition transfer form is filled by the family and school staff should discuss ways to resolve the concerns and help the student and family recommit to their enrolled school. And then I also put a copy of the petition request form in here that talks about have you worked with your student, with your school. Well, what we found is that the ETC department doesn't require necessarily that section be filled out all the way. Sometimes it's filled out, sometimes it's not. But what they said is that sometimes it's a barrier to moving forward with the application overall. If it's missing, to reject it and send it back and say, oh, you gotta fill this out. Whereas they're actually having communications with the individual schools to looking at the rationale. So they're getting that information even though it's not filled out. So I think it'd probably be better to not have it as a required element because, you know, when I'm filling out something and I get to a spot that I don't have an answer to, sometimes that's a deterrent to move forward. So,
In some cases, if you depend, like in a Google
You say, oh, I don't-
other survey tool, you
I don't
cannot
qualify.
move forward
Yeah.
without. But if this is paper, then that's not.
I mean, also it's kind of meaningless because it's self-reported. So,
yeah, so these are just little
It's not
nitpicks. It
help-
says
yeah.
the administrative directive says that you're supposed to do this. Maybe we don't need to have that element in there.
Yeah,
We're
I
not
would
doing
agree.
it consistently, so maybe it shouldn't even be required.
And is it a decision, I mean, are we making decisions based on it or not, because it's not filled out all the time?
That was not a determining factor.
Okay.
So it was inconsistent whether or not
It was
even filled in. And so,
it's also a little patronizing. It's a little patronizing.
okay, yeah.
Like, it's up to them if they think
Yeah.
they have a reason. We'll determine whether they meet the criteria.
Okay, so in discussing this practice with the ETC department, it was stated that requiring this section of the request to be completed could present an undue burden or other unneeded barriers for families. And the ETC explained that for each petition request, they communicate directly with the schools, the student is attending or assigned to attend, and this communication includes whether or not there have been any attempts to resolve the family's concerns. So, the next element of the administrative directive talks about a scale used to evaluate petition reasons, which we just got done talking about.
which we have right behind this.
So what I'm saying is, so what does it say in the administrative directive? The administrative directive says ETC will make available information to assist families in completing petition transfer requests, including a list of frequent reasons for transfer and a scale used to evaluate petition reasons. So what we found is we did find a list of frequent reasons that was available on the website, and but there was no scale. So we said exception, there's no scale. So we need to determine what the scale is and publish it, document it, or say that no scale is gonna be required. But it sounds like we want a scale. So, the next, almost the last element for the administrative directive talks about appeals process needs to be done within 10 working days. And we did find that we found of the 225, 13 decisions were appealed. Of those 13 decisions that were appealed, 4 were, it took more than 10 days to get the outcome. So
That's good though.
yeah, most of the time they got it done in time. So I don't think that's a major problem, but just stating the facts. So we also looked at the policy. So this next section is very specific about the policy. So I did want to give some feedback on this. So the first bullet point, we're on page 19, about halfway down, talking about the policy. It says the superintendent shall establish a process to collect, monitor data from petition transfer requests to ensure equitable processes and decision-making and to identify areas of improvement in neighborhood schools. So I did list an exception there, but that's just because there were a couple of years where the ETC department didn't compile the data. So they, in the past, have done it, and then with COVID, as so many other things, they just kind of missed a couple years. But I know that they're working on moving forward, but just stating that the policy requires this data reporting, and they've missed it the last couple of years. Now, in the policy, we noted neither the policy or the administrative directive specifically state how often the reporting data is required. So the policy does not require it annually, but I think there is an assumption that it doesn't say it specifically. So if there is one note about the policy, is being clear about how often the reporting is required, annually or not. So the second bullet point for the policy is the superintendent shall establish clear, flexible, culturally relevant protocols and standards to the petition transfer process. So based off the results of our audit, really what we talked about in objective 1, where there was some disagreement about what we felt whether or not there was a hardship. So we feel that we found the established protocols and standards are not as clear as necessary to ensure decisions to grant or deny the petition is based on a standard set of criteria. So so updating the administrative directive would really cover that element. It doesn't need to be updated in the policy. The policy statement is good, but how does the superintendent establish that is really through an administrative directive. So
And our results here could be construed as lack of compliance with the policy.
right, it could be, yes. So that is objective 2. For the recommendation on the top of page 20, we recommend the ETC strengthen the internal control structure to ensure compliance with the policy and procedures and administrative directives, policy and administrative directive. If you flip to the tab, again in the back in Appendix C, you'll see I added an additional recommendation for the ETC department to consider when they're looking at implementing that formal recommendation. So there's one extra one there for consideration. So now I feel like I'm trying to hurry, so I'm going to go on to objective 3 really quickly. Objective 3 is to determine whether the hardship petition transfer process has a disproportionate or inequitable impact on a student or school community. I did agree to these objectives, but when I was working on it, I was like, what did I agree to? This was really hard. How could I possibly to do that? And what I thought was really necessary was to drill down into the data. So in this background section, I kind of give you some background about what information I had to work with. The first section there talks about SchoolMint, which is the software system that was used during the time period that I was auditing, where, and then the next, so that's the data source that we had. And then the next section, which is on page 22, midway, it's reporting on the HPT data, request data. So this section talks about the reports that have been provided in the past. So I wanted to look at the summary reports that was last time presented to the policy committee in November of 2019. That was the last time a summary analysis was presented to the committee or the board via any committee. And so I wanted to look at that data for accuracy and completeness, etc. But we were, what we found is we couldn't recreate the data. Let me get one more section. So now let's talk about the reporting on the why. So in our review of the policy committee meeting in November of 2019, there was some discussion in that policy committee meeting about tracking the why. Why are, what's the primary reason for the petition request? And I think it's really important to note that the conversation in that committee is not a directive to staff. That's not the way it works. We don't, it's really important to go through the proper protocols, which would be if a committee wants something from the school district that is not currently being done, it needs to go to the superintendent, and then the superintendent provides the directive. So we'll talk about in our next steps kind of at the end. We will do that process better this time. So if ultimately reporting on the why is wanted, then we'll do a formal request to the superintendent and it, there's proper communication chain for requests goes through the superintendent. So we'll do that. One thing that I want to talk about is reporting on the why. So even though it was kind of requested, but not formally, it wasn't being tracked moving forward. So what I did is I did it for the 225 that we tested. So if you look at page 23, putting a petition request in any one category was really difficult. I'll give you one example. We had a petition talking all about this academic program that they wanted to get into. And then in the last sentence, they had a co-enrolled sibling. So they got in because they got the co-enrolled sibling. But really, it was very academic what they wanted. So it's really hard to say the primary reason because there were a few. So
well, they're intersecting reasons probably.
So it was really hard to
Lots of
categorize them. But for the best we could, we did try to dump them into one of the categories. So I was thinking, if we have, how can we add value? What are we going to get out of this? And if you look here, you'll see that there's still 53 in the other category. Mm-hmm. And what that means is less than 5 were in the category. So if there was less than 5 in any one category, I put them as the other. If we have more than 10 categories, I'm just not sure there's a lot of value in receiving that information. How does that really give you a basis for decision making? So trying to put them in a specific category was difficult. But I did dump them in, and this is what we got. There were still 53 in the other, and then one other category I wanted to point out was the return to neighborhood schools, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah,
21.
final, the formal.
Yeah, so this was, they wanted to go back to their neighborhood school, which, you know, pretty much gets approved.
Yeah.
So if their neighborhood school is full, then they have to wait to the following academic year. So there may not be a mid-year transfer if that's what they're wanting. If their neighborhood school is full, but, you know, all students have a right to go to their neighborhood school, so in the following academic year, they would be able to go back to their neighborhood school. So I thought that was an interesting category, that there were quite a few students who were returning to their neighborhood schools.
Also the siblings though, because if siblings have priority, then they shouldn't.
No, they still have to do the request.
still
They
need to do
still
a
have to do
request.
a petition request to say, hey, I've co-enrolled sibling, this, so.
Is that just so we can track that particular request and track it with?
Well, so one example that I can think of off the top of my head was a student had lotteried into a specific program. So now this student had gotten into the program,
Okay,
and then they had a sibling
okay,
who didn't get in via the lottery, so they did a petition request to get in.
okay.
That's just one random example to kind of, you know, but there were lots of different examples of why.
But you can't petition to get in when there otherwise would be a lottery. You can petition to get in like on the community side of the same school, so they're in the same building, right?
After the lottery closes, you can petition.
Oh, you can?
And you could be approved or added to the wait list.
Oh, okay.
Based on
Even
the
if you had
circumstances.
been, I mean, presumably you would have been prioritized in the lottery process as a sibling. And then even if you didn't get it, you still have another avenue you can pursue.
So for example, Benson, because they didn't fill all of their slots in the lottery, is still open for transfer. We do use the petition as the documentation process to process that transfer.
Makes sense.
But it's just it's like open enrollment. It's like an extension of the lottery. It's not based on hardship for that particular student as much as it is the hardship is that they miss the timeline.
Right.
And we do have siblings that miss or don't realize that every student is supposed to go through a transfer process to attend a school other than their neighborhood school, if they have a sibling.
So, objective 3 results. In our testing, we found that the data currently collected in SchoolMint is not adequate to determine actual impact because the final outcomes of the hardship petition requests are not collected or reconciled. For example, in SchoolMint, 92 of the 225 petitions that we looked at, so 92 of them were approved. Of those 92, 10 did not ultimately result in the transfer. So throughout our system in SchoolMint, it says approved, but that student didn't actually enroll in the school in which they were approved to go. And there was no reconciliation of that to actuals, which means that looking at the outcome, the actual impacts of the petition process, we can't do because we don't know the actual impacts. When 10 of 92 that were approved didn't result in an actual transfer, that's kind of a big number. You know, I would have loved to do a statistical analysis and be able to project my errors, but that's not the way I did the audit. But it's still a big number. And so if there's no way to reconcile the actual outcome, you can't determine the impact on any specific school because we don't know what the impact is. So this was actually one of the hardest conclusions I've ever concluded on, and I tried very hard not to have to conclude this way. I actually learned very unique things to try to come up with some way of presenting actual impacts, and actually talked to a census person at the county to get I was working really hard on a great data analysis of the actual impacts, but I just can't because that amount of non-transferring, once it's been approved, just would skew the outcomes and the
I don't
data
think
would be
that's the
reliable.
most relevant piece
Yeah,
of
so-
information either.
So that's the conclusion on this kind of, so I couldn't give you a conclusion for objective 3, because the data's not reliable. But I will say, the ETC department does present from one school to another school in the data that was presented back in November of 2019. They did give a school by, how many petitions for transfers in, how many for potential transfers out for each school. And there's tons of charts in the packet that's attached to the policy committee meeting in November of 2019. And just in case anybody wants to see what they have provided in the past. So they do that. But what I'm saying is what is provided may not actually be accurate, because they didn't actually result in
Just because
the
it was
transfer.
approved, they did, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And wasn't at the time any way of reconciling that.
Now approved to actuals.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, in the recommendation that we improve data collection processes, is it your sense that that is possible within the systems that we have, within the layers of schoolment and the levels of schoolment that we have? Or do we require a different infrastructure or added layers of infrastructure to get information that we think would be useful?
Well, I think that is a really great question. And I would have answered it differently, except for this morning. I did talk to Judy, and she mentioned that they're working on getting a new
That's what I'm
a different version, something new other than schoolment. So I don't want to get
Bonanza?
too excited. I want to stick to the recommendations. I don't know how far along they are in the process, but if there would have been a way in which they could have done it using the system that we had in schoolment, it just would have required additional customization of the program. That has a cost. So
Right.
then you want to look at a cost benefit analysis. So, but if we're getting a whole new system, this is actually a great time to say what exactly we would like as far as data collection.
Yeah.
So then they can go into it and set it up that way moving forward.
Yeah.
So to conclude on objective 3 for this recommendation, the recommendation is that we recommend that ETC strengthen the data collection process and procedures to ensure the data is accurate, complete, and ensures equitable processes in decision-making, and to identify areas of improvement in neighborhood schools. So I really want, so that's the primary recommendation. I stopped short of doing a recommendation to collect the why, because I don't necessarily see a lot of value in collecting the why whenever I looked at it. That's just, Mary Catherine and I's perspective. So I didn't want to go there. I just want to do the recommendation at a high level. So we need to make sure that the data is presented is accurate. So we will need a way to reconcile the actuals outcome, and also really thinking about what data could provide a decision-making ability to inform a decision-making process. Is it really how many students requests are in and out for each school? When you look at that in the documentation that's available on the policy committee, I looked at it, I didn't really see how that would necessarily inform any decisions. So
Because you're looking at a straight count,
Right.
a straight count versus an impact.
Right.
And
Well, not just that, but even if the numbers were accurate, just saying this school had 5 in and 5 out. Well,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
Right,
Like,
Yeah.
what does it
Kind
mean?
of-
So
It's not a-
to be more
yeah.
intentional about the data we're collecting to add value as opposed to being a taxing operation is important. So one of the things that I think to talk about moving forward is the time went by so fastly, but what we want to do is I know that Judy is anxious to hear what the feedback is. So the recommendation in the report is much high level. We gotta at least make sure the data is accurate and complete and presenting information that adds value. But what information adds value? How do you make those decisions? I think there would be some value in brainstorming that. What do you want? What information is going to help you make decisions? And so that is not included in the report. So based off our discussions, and I know that I'm out of time now, but I will follow up with you guys to get additional notes and feedback. I'll summarize what those initial thoughts are. I talked to the Chief of Staff, Jonathan Garcia, before the meeting, and I talked to him. I'll send him the email. He can go through the superintendent and decide if this is a directive, but we will not be directing staff to do anything different. We're just, we'll
It's a
go through
question
the proper protocols of saying, hey, the audit committee thinks collecting this data would add value. Then we'll send it on and do the proper protocol.
Okay,
Does that
I
make
would
sense?
love to be involved in those conversations, just because I think I could maybe add value to the.
I'm not done. I think one of the most critical pieces
That piece.
is, oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I thought
go
you were done. Is looping in the chief of schools and his team on recommendation 1, which centers around principal discretion in determining capacity.
Well, if you look at the response to the recommendations, they're actually, they're doing that. But I'll let,
I do wanna just say that,
they,
the audit reflects, analysis of work that was done at a certain time. We have made a number of adjustments, and I would hope you would see improvements since that time that are not
Okay.
reflected in the
I
audit.
was gonna ask you if you want to respond right now. I mean, your management response is in here, but.
Yeah, and you have it, it's brief, but to say that, we are actively, working on this very question of, assessing space. I think, that at the school level, at the department level, certainly at the family level, we would like it to be more, clear on, what the criteria is for decision. I also added in my response, other factors that influence a principal's decision around space availability. I would, on behalf of our partners in the Office of Schools, push back hard on any notion that just a rubric on maximum class size is the only factor.
Yeah.
But we don't always know why, and when we don't know why, obviously it can lead to, it just doesn't help bring up the integrity of the process. So we are focused right now on middle schools, which is outside, like you were looking at the K-5 where it's a little more concrete because
it's
they're
a lot
mostly-
easier to
But
test.
middle school is actually where we've had the most challenge with trying to place kids. It's where we've had the highest demand and the least amount of ability to meet that demand in the last year. So in to be as responsive as possible, we're going there. Another thing that we're doing is through the lottery, we've now sort of brought lottery transfer slots in line with metrics that are in the staffing guidelines. And so we can apply those to the petition process post-lottery, right? So we're establishing what we expect class sizes to be at focus options. We're meeting with our dual language immersion principals to fine tune that so that within those DLI classrooms, we're also factoring in like, what's the proportion of native speakers and what's the impact if you take 5 more English speaking kids to these slots? versus holding some back for native speakers.
So otherwise you'd have those all at their maximum and then our neighborhood schools at varying levels. That's not the right
So-
solution either.
So I think that I'm just trying to illustrate the different steps that we're taking to, because I don't think that there's a single answer for everything, right? Like there's no one
One
metric.
size fits all.
But those are the areas that have been identified by our Office of Schools partners as priorities this year, like middle schools, dual language immersion, and then we are working on the focus options because we've established those, thanks to Director Brim Edwards for initiating work in that direction last summer that influenced the lottery. So we learned from the lottery, we apply it then to the petition level. So that's an example of how we're approaching it so far. I just wanted you to know that we haven't just sat on this whole time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I also appreciate your reporting out on this. And just to put a fine point on it, it sounds like there's work happening, right? There's some process improvement and that there's continues to be some work that needs to be addressed.
So that
There's
leads
still a
us
couple
to
out-
next steps. So
Next
what do
steps.
we do next? So we want to follow up on the implementation of the recommendations. That's one of the primary responsibility of the audit committee. So I will send the kind of action plan or implementation plan tracker, put them in there, send it over to Judy, and she will go in and say what exactly she's gonna do to implement this recommendation. She could copy and paste a couple of the things from my back
Yes.
recommendations, or pick more things, or whatever. But it's, their department's responsible to come up with a plan to implement the high-level recommendations. And then she will provide that to the audit committee, and then we'll follow up on it. Once they've been implemented, I can go in and confirm they're implemented, and we'll get to sign off on it like we did for the P card in our last audit committee meeting. Or maybe it might take a while to get some of them implemented. But the next step is for the department to say, this is what we're gonna do very specifically to implement the recommendations, and they'll provide that to the audit committee. That's what's next. What I would offer is, sounds like there are some more feedback that we could generate from the audit committee. So what I can do is, over this next month or so, reach out to each audit committee member, take the notes down, anything you think of that might add value or whatever, and then summarize that, and I'll bring it to our June audit committee meeting. And then then you guys can look at it, and if that's okay, we'll forward it along to the chief of staff to go through the formal process of whether or not this is because it's not a directive, we're just saying, this would add value for this committee. So if that's okay, I'll do that. I love talking to each of you individually, so I will do that, and I will summarize it. I'll bring it to the committee, since we have to talk about it in the committee. In our next audit committee, I think in June, we'll formally say, yes, this is the list of things we want to send over for them to consider in the implementation of their recommendation. If that's okay with everybody, then we wouldn't expect to get a implementation, action of implementation from the department until probably the fall.
Okay,
that's
so
kind of the
it wouldn't
timeframe.
be, okay,
Well, they want to get our feedback first, right? So
Yes.
we talked a lot, we have some things we talked about here. I'll make sure to get any other ideas from everyone, bring them, so hopefully that makes sense. Does
Can I
that
just
make sense?
Clarify from a process and governance perspective,
Yes.
not on the substance, but there is a management response to the audit recommendations, and I hear that is coming.
Yeah. No, it's in the
It's
It's
here
in-
from,
it's-
I understand, but she's gonna then tell what the implementation piece are, you've just.
Yeah, so the response is just whether or not you would agree with the recommendation or not. And it doesn't necessarily include what exactly you're gonna do to implement the recommendation.
So is then the individual meetings with the audit committee members to solicit individual feedback is just another list of suggestions from individual board members as opposed to collective direction
That's a
from
good point, because
I think
our
it is-
individual, this is our forum to provide our individual
That's a-
feedback, and
Right.
each of us individually doesn't have any power. Right.
Well, and it just, I just wanna be clear what's being asked of staff, if this is a direction from the committee or
Yeah.
just, and I think that's,
It sounded
or
like
it goes to the policy committee for additional work on the policy directive that's needed. I'm not sure, I just wanna make
so
sure
in
that
terms of
governance
next steps, right? Because there are some of the things that you mentioned require looking at the policy and either like adding some verbiage or removing. So are you looking at like the order of operations?
I'm looking at two issues, and again, just from a governance perspective, individualized feedback that's not a direction of the committee.
Okay,
And that's one decision to make. I mean, obviously, individual board members have ideas all the time, and this is a different
Yes.
structure for that. I haven't seen this as part of an audit, as part of the process. The second is which committee? Is it the audit committee in response to the audit, or making recommendations to the policy committee, or to, I'm just trying
Yeah,
to figure
it-
out what the path is and the governance structure.
it seems like we should, this is the committee, this is the forum for us to give feedback as a group, not as individuals. And so I feel like it needs to kind of be resolved here in terms of next steps, and then we'll decide that it goes to the policy committee second.
I think that's the right call, although
that
you're
the-
not
I mean-
calling for policy changes.
So,
No, but there
I don't
were
think-
some suggestions to look at the language.
Individual
The
board members might.
administrative
It was- they were
directive, not
80s.
policy.
They were the ADs.
I think it should, I think it.
I actually talked to
here.
the chief of staff before our meeting because I had a feeling that this would be, there would be some impact, and so I wanted to chat with him, how could we do this in the proper protocol? So the proper protocol is the audit committee or any other committee doesn't provide directives to staff. And I think an example of that is from the policy committee meeting back in November of 19, where the policy committee clearly indicated they wanted tracking of the why, but there was no formal request to do that provided to the superintendent, and then the superintendent would then need to provide the directive to staff. So because that was an experience
failed.
in the policy committee, I wanted to talk to Jonathan beforehand and say, we don't want the information, the feedback just to go away. So how can we formally provide
Make a
this and follow
request.
the proper protocols? So what he and I discussed beforehand was that I would do a summary and send it to him. He would then talk to the superintendent and work through a formal directive, because we're not going to be directing. You guys get to direct me because
But we
you're the
can't-
boss
yes,
of
we
me,
can't direct
but
staff.
nobody else. So that's what you can direct me to do, is summarize it and send it to him, and then he can move it from there. But to answer your question, it sounded to me as we were getting into some of the details, there was more input that time has run out on. So about the why, whether or not you want the tracking of the why, or what data elements is gonna help you better make decisions or identify areas of improvement. If you have those thoughts and we didn't talk about them, then I'll reach out to each of you. I'll document it, I'll summarize, I'll bring it back to the audit committee. And then in our next meeting, we'll say, yes, these are what the input we provided. And once the audit committee says, yes, this is what we would like to send to the superintendent via the chief of staff, then we will do that. That answer.
It kind of, but it raises another question of soliciting individual input that's gonna be aggregated in a meeting. And
Yeah,
it comes
Yeah,
down to having a meeting without a meeting, so.
yeah.
I think,
Sorry.
I think my recommendation from
Yeah.
a governance standpoint is to either have individual board members submit their
Yes.
individual ideas. It can go to the chief of staff and it goes on its merry way through staff, or the committee gets together and have a conversation together in the room.
I like the former.
I do too,
suggestion.
I like the former as well.
Okay,
So it doesn't mean that there will never be another discussion, but it'll probably be outside the context of this audit.
Yeah.
In terms of policy development or practices or updates. The board certainly has great interest in this topic. It's just trying to keep.
Yes.
so I would say email those suggestions or thoughts to me.
To you directly,
I will summarize, I'll
Okay.
bring them back to
and we'll
Committee next
still,
No, so you'll bring them back to Jonathan.
John.
bring it back to Jonathan, and Jonathan will
And Judy,
a recommendation. Is that, okay,
Yes.
thank you for that. Did that answer your question?
That works.
Okay.
Sorry.
I just got it.
I
You got
just
there.
know that there's so much, I was really excited to get a whole hour and it went by so fast. But I know that I knew we were gonna have thoughts and putting people on the spot to say, tell me what your thoughts are about this and what are you thinking? You can go home and digest it and think about it, really think what would add value. Send an
Well,
email.
whether it'll add value.
Whether it would add
Yeah.
value. Do you even, like,
Or-
yeah,
There is this-
there was
I need
some
to think
things we
about
were
that too.
collecting data on, I was like, oh, that's a lot of work for them to do, that, what is it helping?
Like,
You know, what's the decision that it's informing, so.
Right.
Yeah,
wanna
and
be
for
mindful.
me,
I wanted to, I don't know if Christian, it looks like he might not be on the call. He was quiet. I wanted to make sure he didn't have any final thoughts. But I don't think he's here.
I was just gonna say, I think I was one of the people who expressed in that policy committee meeting that I was very interested in the why and finding a way to track it, but actually now that I think about it, as long as I can feel confident that we are, adhering to our strict set of criteria, I don't need to see the why, and I think it's each principal is going to see the in and out from his or her school, which is relevant to them. But I think writ large, I don't think it, to me, it doesn't matter.
Right, so, that's kind of where I felt, like, I didn't wanna do a formal conclusion to say, let's start tracking this. Cause when I looked at it, I was like, oh, I don't know what, but that's just one opinion, and so it's important
I'm
to see different
on the fence about it
perspectives and
because-
think about it.
Thank you. I'm on the fence about it because I think sometimes it's what you measure.
Yeah.
And measuring, when you're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, it's tracking information, whether you do anything with it or not. But I need to think a little bit harder about that.
Yep.
I think we're concluded and going to adjourn now, as long as there aren't any more questions around the table.
I did just want to make a point because of the system we're switching over to. Somebody had
Yes.
alluded to, it's not part of the ERP project, it's not, it is part of our business modernization, it's not part of the enterprise resource planning. It is attached and it's a component that's directly related into our student information system, which we're actually very excited about because it keeps all of that information and it gives a better holistic understanding of the students that are currently in the system. So, I just didn't want there to be any confusion about where that lies.
Lives. Okay. I appreciate that.
After I introduce that.
Well, you asked a valid question because that is part of
I
the
would have
big
assumed.
movement forward for the district, right?
I would have assumed the same thing. So thank you all for
Really,
being
really
here.
good
Thank
work,
you.
Janice. Thank you.
I just want to
And
also
thanks
say
to
one
West
more
Wes.
world
thing.
has people with brains like yours, because I know.
I love the details,
I
but
think
also just thank you to the staff of the ETC department, it's
Yes.
really
Yes.
hard to get audited.
Yeah.
And it, to have somebody really picking through your
Yeah.
work, I can foresee it being very stressful, so I try to make it as pleasant of a possible of an experience, but I'm not always sure others would describe getting audited as a pleasant experience, so I just wanna make sure and say thank you for speaking with us and answering all of our questions and letting us dig into all of the details as hard as it is. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Judy. Okay, with that, we're adjourned.
Thanks,